Thad Brown along with AJ Feldman and Carl Jones talking about the big signing, the big ticket item probably for this free agency period. Never know. But the Bills did land a notable receiver, Curtis Samuel, the 27-year-old. He'll turn 28 in November, so not an older guy. Bills get him for 3 years and 24, 3 years, $8 million per. Not a cheap price, but look, this is a good player at a mostly reasonable price. Now, guys, give me your, before we get into kind of our detailed thoughts about this, AJ, go first. Just give me your initial knee-jerk reaction to the idea of Curtis Samuel becoming a Buffalo Bill.
I mean, obviously they had a need at wide receiver, and I still think they do. But obviously, this is a good signing, a reasonable price. We'll see exactly what the terms of the deal turn out to be. It'll probably be something like an effective 2-year, $20 million contract, something like that, 18, something like in that range as to what it actually is. But no, it's a fine move. It's a fine pickup. He's had some good chemistry with Joe Brady in the past. His best season was in 2020. So, the Bills like their continuity, and they're going to have a little bit of that. If this is their biggest move for free agency in the draft at wide receiver, it's a failure of an offseason, but it's early to declare that. So assuming they take a receiver in the first or second round, a bigger guy, a guy that can play on the outside and fill more of that Gabe Davis role, I think it's fine. If they, for some reason think that this is enough at receiver, and I don't think they think that. They've done a good job of identifying their holes. They didn't work out with Kyrie, but they had a hole at cornerback. They took their cornerback in the draft. I think they'll do the same thing this time around. So right now, I give this signing a thumbs up.
I want to dive a little more into the idea of the Bills going into the draft needing or maybe not needing as badly another receiver. But Carl, just give me your initial knee jerk to the idea of Curtis Samuel being a Bill.
I mean, quite frankly, for me, going into the free agency, I didn't really think that they were going to be able to accomplish any of their needs at wide receiver, because high-end receivers don't ever hit the market. Like, you can look the past 10, 15 years, the best receivers that have ever hit the market, we're talking about Christian Kirk, a 31-year-old DeAndre Hopkins. Like, just good receivers don't hit the market. You either trade for them or you draft them. So when you're talking about a guy of Curtis Samuel's caliber, you're talking about guys who wide receiver 3 and 4 that you hope will be on your roster that can accomplish some type of skill set, some type of need that your roster may be lacking. So for me personally, I didn't really have expectations on the wide receiver position heading into this period. I've known of Curtis Samuel since for a decade now because of the Ohio State stuff. So I'm familiar with who he is as a player. He's electrifying when he has the ball in his hands. And I think they've needed some more yak, and I think he can accomplish that part of the game. So first knee-jerk reaction, cool, y'all got another receiver, but unfortunately this wasn't the time, or isn't the time, where they can accomplish what they really need, which is a wide receiver too.
Yeah, my first thought was, this is a good player. I like him, but the fit felt wrong from the moment. Maybe not wrong, but just inexact, not clean. There were a lot of things about this that had me raising or thinking questions with it. AJ, let me go back to the idea about where Samuel will fit in with the receiver depth chart. There were many Bills fans who look at this as a solution, maybe the solution to wide receiver. This is a guy that can play on the outside, replace Gabe Davis, and be the number 2. What would your take be if we ended up getting to September and the Bills roll out Stephon Diggs, Curtis Samuel, and Khalil Shakir as their top 3 receivers?
Yeah, the thing is, there's just a lot of overlap between Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel's skill set in terms of where they play, kind of what they do. They make, possession catches. They try and run after the catch. And people are kind of talking about on Twitter that, Washington didn't use him right. He's played outside in the past. He can be an outside receiver. Well, he played outside for the first 3 years of his career. He took 72% of his snaps on the outside. He wasn't all that effective outside. Granted, he was young, so, you expect people to get better. But in 2020, he started playing in the slot a lot more. That was the year when he was with Joe Brady in Carolina. He had his best season. And from 2020 on, he's kind of basically been an outside guy. 74% of his snaps in the slot, over 1,000 in the slot compared to just 370 wide. So clearly, as he's gone on in his career, teams, whoever the offensive coordinator it is, his current offensive coordinator right now, they've seen him as a slot guy. So there's a lot of overlap in the skill potential of Samuel and Khalil Shakir. So now it's up to Joe Brady to use these guys correctly, whoever they have, because in the past 2 years, they haven't really found a way to use these, skill guys, quick guys, Naheem Hines, Deontay Hardy. They really haven't flourished in the offense. Granted, this was for the most part under Ken Dorsey, but they haven't been really able to figure out how to use these guys in the past few years.
I will say that I think Samuel is kind of the supersized version of Isaiah McKenzie, Deontay Hardy. So I think they're better at that gadget spot, if that what Samuel is going to be. To your point about, Bills fans talking about using him outside, this is kind of like the Family Guy episode where Peter can either have a boat or what's in a little box. He's like, a boat's a boat, but the box could be anything. Right now, Curtis Samuel is anything. Like he could be that. He could be but he never played with Josh Allen before. He could be the outside guy. He could do all these things. And I think we probably got to remember, what he's been, to your point, is probably what he's going to be, which is a slot receiver. And Carl, now that, Curtis Samuel's on board as a guy who probably is primarily a slot, well, the Bills kind of had a guy who looked like he might primarily be a slot in Khalil Shakir. And frankly, to that point, they have a tight end in Dalton Kincaid they spent a first-round pick on, who probably looks like a guy who should be playing mostly in the slot. So how do the Bills, fit Shakir and Samuel and Kincaid all together?
Yeah, that was the big takeaway after I got away from the name recognition, is that they do occupy the same parts of the field. But I think there's one thing that needs to be stated with this conversation in terms of slot receivers. There is a massive difference between a slot receiver and guys who are best used in the slot. And I think that's a distinction that this Bills team is going to have to figure out over the next few months or so before they hit training camp and into the regular season. Khalil Shakir, Dawson Kincaid, and Curtis Samuel are all best used in the slot, but that doesn't mean that you should have them there 100% of the snaps. Like Cole Beasley is a guy who is a pure slot receiver. I don't want him anywhere else. I don't want him in the backfield, out wide at X or Z, put him out there at Y or H. Those guys can be moved around a bit. I mean, we've seen Khalil Shakir line up in the backfield, do some angle routes, things of that nature. Curtis Samuel came into Ohio State as a running back, so like he's clearly a versatile weapon. And Dawson Kincaid can split out time to time and put him out there need be. I don't want him out there all the time, but he can do it in a pinch. It's going to be interesting. It's up to Joe Brady to see if he can do it. I will say there are teams around the league who have duplicate skill sets that have found a way to be really efficient. I mean, we look at the 49ers, and I know that they are all pros everywhere, but Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Kyle Juszczyk, Christian McCaffrey all occupy these same parts of the field. It's not like none of those guys are deep threats. Ayuk is a little different. He's a legit receiver. Those guys are all intermediate to short guys. And I know they have the best offensive coordinator, offensive guru that this game has seen in 10, 15 years, but you look at the Rams, Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, both occupy the same parts of the field with Tyler Higbee that was there as well. They found a way to make it work. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but the good offensive coordinators figure out ways to use chess pieces and make the offense efficient. We'll see how Joe Brady does that, but it's a possibility that it can be done. I mean, the Niners and Rams do it every single year.
Yeah, I think the Niners comparison is a really, really good one because the Bills do have the pieces to kind of make that offense work. I mean, you think about it right now, and we'll get into the draft part of this in a minute, but let's say theoretically the Bills do grab whoever they get in the draft, whether first, second, fourth, fifth, whatever round it is. Let's say that guy is really good, pretty good. Well, now you can roll out Stephon Diggs, pretty good guy X, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, Dalton Kincaid, James Cook. All those guys are plus receivers, and you can't even play all five of them at the same time. It's 6 guys, and you're going to have 5 that you feel, maybe not Shakir at this point. I like him, but I don't know if the Bills do as much. Regardless, you've got some depth there. The one other part of this that I want to talk about with Samuel is that he's seen as a speed guy. Now, I don't know how much of that is down the field speed. I mean, if you can fly, you can fly, but for the most part, he has made his bones, his name in the NFL being kind of the end around guy, the screen guy, the gadget guy. And, to that point, he is a low rated deep target the last 3 years he's played, 2020, 2022, 2023. He was hurt in 21. This is a guy that was towards the bottom, if not at the bottom, when it comes to deep targets. Now, to be fair, he did get a bunch of deep targets early in his career, but, AJ already pointed out that was almost a different guy at this point. And when he got a lot of deep targets, he really wasn't very good. His efficiency was terrible. So, Carl, let me throw this back at you. The doc on social media today about that was, and this is kind of touching on a couple things we already hit on, well, he wasn't used properly or his quarterback wasn't good. Well, these last 3 seasons, we're talking about 3 different coordinators, 2 different teams. I don't know how many quarterbacks. I guess it's not out of the realm. Anything is possible. But how reasonable is it to expect that Curtis Samuel, a guy who, when he's been good, has really never been a deep threat, will suddenly be that for the Bills? And when you answer that question, I'm going to follow up for you too.
I don't think speed means that you're a good deep threat, because I think there's things that go into being a deep threat receiver in terms of ball tracking, in terms of being able to play through contact, things of that nature. He's a really fast guy with the ball in his hands. I've never really thought of him as a guy who I want going 30, 40 yards. He didn't do that at Ohio State. He didn't do that with Cam Newton. He didn't do that with Teddy. Like, he's just never been that guy. He's just the guy who's really darn fast, that is really good with the ball in his hands. So in terms of lining him out at wide and say, hey, go beat Pat Surtain on a go route, like, we trust you. Like, that's never really been his game. He's been a guy who's, like AJ alluded to earlier, an athlete that they've tried to mold it into a more of a receiver who may not be the most technically refined guy, but when he has the ball in his hands and spaces, he can make things happen. But I never really thought of him as a guy where, like, hey, go beat Tyreek Hill and call check fade. Like that, I've never really thought of him in that way.
So to that point, now look at the Bills' offense is currently constituted. You've got Curtis Samuel, Mr. Horizontal, 5 to 15-yard guy. Stephon Diggs, who is, look, a jack of all trades. I mean, not just a jack, but a really good receiver still. Maybe not as good as he used to be, but still really good. Dalton Kincaid, Mr. Tight End. Those guys are not 30-yard down the field guys just in general. And then Khalil Shakir, who's also generally an underneath guy. So to me, if the Bills don't add anything at receiver, if I'm playing D, I'm going to go too high, put 5 guys in the short zone and make Josh Allen throw 14 5-yard passes to get up and down the field every drive. So AJ, let's go now to the forward to the draft. What the Bills do, they just added a receiver. This is a team that we talked about needing help at receiver as long ago as December. Do they need a receiver less now because they have Curtis Samuel?
I don't think so. I think the need for receiver is still there. And the good thing about the draft, you guys can get into specific players, more than I can, but this is a draft that has outside guys. It's not last year where, guys are in the slot. Me and Carl were talking about this yesterday. Needing an outside receiver, an X receiver in this draft doesn't restrict you in who you're trying to take with your first round pick for the most part. So I think they certainly need a wide receiver, and you kind of got to hit it because, with Stephon Diggs getting older, potentially playing less on the outside, maybe turning into more of a slot. If you don't hit on this receiver in your first round, you're going to have a lot of guys who are best in the slot, as we were talking about before. So it's a very important draft pick for them to get right this year.
Carl, kind of the same thought, and actually to AJ, he talks about what the draft is, about which guy we like. I mean, if you talk about the top 8 to 10 to 15 receivers, and you're like, can that guy stretch the field? The answer is going to be yes for almost all of them, which is great about this draft. But, for you, where's your priority / urgency level for whether the Bills not only need to get a receiver, but how early they have to get a receiver?
I think it's still fairly high. And once again, like I said earlier, you get good receivers through the draft or via trade, and they're not going to trade a bunch of capital to get a guy as long as Stephon Diggs is still on the roster. So the other way to do that is via the draft. And I think there is 8 to 10 to 15 and probably 20 guys who are going to see substantial time as rookies from the wide receiver position this year. But I think that first 6 to 7 are guys who you can really count on day one to play, especially with you got a guy like Josh Allen and a person who can learn from Stephon Diggs as well. So also, I like to build my receiver rooms like basketball teams. And what I mean by that is you want the slot receiver, your point guards, the shorter guys. You want your centers, the dunkers, things of that nature, small forwards who can do a little bit of all. And right now, the Bills don't have that big body, that power forward, that center. And I think that's what you will want to get and be at a draft with a big X receiver, whether that's an A.D. Mitchell, who's a bigger guy, a Brian Thomas, Xavier Legette, things of that nature. So I think you still need to build a room like it's a hoop team. They got a nice little backcourt right now. They need some bigs out there, and I think they'll accomplish that.
But they have
in late April.
They have future All-Pro Justin Shorter, though. Are we forgetting about him?
You're right. He off the bench right now. He ain't in the starting 5 right now. He coming off the bench. We don't know how he is going to be when the lights get bright, but I think they need to get another guy who's a legit power forward.
And to that point, I was thinking about this today. So we could sit here and talk about how deep the draft is and how you're going to get a guy in the 3rd round who's awesome. When it's actually time for the Bills to pick, and let's say Brian Thomas is off the board at 28, because he probably will be. And we'll put aside the idea of the Bills trading up, which I absolutely will not discount after I make the point I'm about to make. It's one thing to sit here and say, oh, yeah, there's going to be guys. It's another thing to think, well, I'm picking at 28, and there's 31 guys who are going to go between now and then. And I know everybody in the league thinks a ton of them that are going to go in that spot of receivers. I think I was on the CBS draft rankings, and they had 10 or 11 or 12 guys in the top 60 who are receivers. I don't think the Bills can afford to wait past 28 to grab their receiver, because not only now do you need a guy, but you need a specific type of guy. You need, to Carl's point, the big guy. To my point, you need the field stretcher. You can't just, like, Ladd McConkey is off the Bills' board as far as I'm concerned. They could take him, but he is not the fit that you want for this team. So if I'm Buffalo, not only do I not allow the receiver that I want or a receiver I'm comfortable with get past me in pick 28, I am absolutely overpaying if I need to trade up and grab a guy. I mean, like Brian Thomas right now, and to me, he's a lot further from the third best receiver than he is to the fifth. Regardless, he's probably the fourth. He's a guy that I'm targeting almost no matter what the cost is right now, unless, the scouts like somebody else a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. You got guys like him. AD Mitchell's another big guy as well. Keon Coleman, another big guy. Like we just said, the Bills aren't the only team that need receivers, and they're not the only team that's like aware of the fact that this is a generational, whatever, really, really good receiver class. You wait to 60. Now you talking about, we could have waited for Keon Coleman. We could have waited for or Jermaine Burke. Yeah, all right. The Chiefs need a guy too, and I'm sure that everyone else is like, man, our receiving core isn't that good. And we can talk about another day about like the wide receiver contracts and why it's better to acquire these guys as rookies anyways, just how expensive that room is getting. The Bills need to attack that position early and often.
And especially, I kind of briefly mentioned Kyer Elam. That was a guy who, they hoped could turn into a guy, but did seem to be a player that needed some time to adapt to their system, to grow into that role. I think the Bills might have learned a lesson there. I don't think they can afford to draft a raw guy, a guy that's going to take time to develop, because if this receiver you take in, maybe you wait until the second round. If he takes until his third year to develop, that's 2 years of Josh Allen's prime that you're really missing a part of your offense that you would want to have with a strong, big-armed quarterback. So I think it is important that they take a guy in the first round that they can at least think that they can trust in that first year, definitely that second year.
And I think it's a little bit of hyperbole to say that like this receiver pick is going to determine the next 2-3 years of the Bills' future, because there's not other things they can do. But this receiver pick will go a long way towards determining how easy it is for the Bills to score points, to move the ball, because this is going to be, the guy who theoretically replaces Stephon Diggs as the number one. This is going to be the guy who you kind of build your passing offense around. So they need to get this pick right. Let me throw a question at you, because I thought of this earlier today. So the Bills have about $9 million in salary cap room left. They still need a safety desperately. There's guys out there. I think a good chunk of that money is going to go towards a safety. So assuming that might be the end of the big time spend free agency. So they spent $8 million, we think, on Curtis Samuel. They saved $8 million by releasing Mitch Morse, which was the most controversial cut decision from last week. Sitting here right now, let's assume they get a decent receiver. Would you rather have Curtis Samuel at that $8 million to create this receiving core that might be really, really good, but you got to lose your center that you loved, and you're also moving your guard over, and you might even take your sixth lineman and make him somebody who's not as good? Or would you rather not have Samuel, make Shakir the slot, but keep that offensive line that you had last year that you liked intact, even if your center is older and certainly a little more concussion prone than most guys? Carl, I'm going to give you the answer to that question first, because I felt like giving you the answer first.
I think that's a tough one, man. I mean, you're really banking on Aaron Cromer. I think this entire offseason, though, I think the Bills have kind of shown that they're really betting on themselves and their coaching and in their development. And I have no issue with that line of thinking. I'm a big believer in that philosophy regardless. But you're really taking a risk here, taking away or tearing apart one of the top 5-7 offensive line units all year. I mean, I'm not really a big believer in Samuel's wide receiver 3 or 4 or whatever. Like, players play, and I'm not here for the hierarchy. But I do wonder if how we're gonna learn. I guess I'll say this as a cop out. I don't know how good of a coach Joe Brady is yet. If he is one of those guys who we can trust as an offensive coordinator, who can eventually be one of those gurus, give him more weapons and let him cook, because those guys are at a premium in this league, and those guys usually tend to be the most successful in terms of the offensive guys. So not knowing what Joe Brady is at this moment, I would probably say stick with Mitch Morse, because the offensive line is protecting Josh Allen is numero uno of importance. But if we find out Joe Brady is one of those guys, I'm all for it.
I think I'd probably take the Morse option. It's certainly the safer option. If you run back Morse, your offensive line, Shakir, whatever, I think you know what you're getting. What they went the road they went, shifting around pieces on the offensive line, adding receivers, changing things up, there's a lot higher potential for a boom and there's a lot higher potential for a bust, which, to play devil's advocate, doing the stability thing, doing the safe thing, doing the continuity thing hasn't really worked for the Bills over the last 4 years. So maybe this is the move that they need to make to, get some more variance in their offense and, their team building potential.
I, for one, land on the receiver side for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're going to be ridiculously deep at a spot in the NFL, I think receiver is the spot I would pick, because you can run all those guys out at different times. It's not like corner where you really can only play 2, or safety you can play 2. I mean, obviously edge, if you had 1,000 Von Millers in his prime, that'd be better. But other than that, receiver is a spot where you can do a lot of things. So I'm kind of okay with overspending there. I don't, in this particular case, I don't hate the idea of Connor McGovern moving over. We know he can play guard. If they want to play David Edwards at guard, we know he can play guard. I don't think you're killing your offensive line. Now, granted, Shakir at slot is not a terrible option either, so that wouldn't have been bad. The other thing is, though, I think the Bills need to come to grips with the idea that as good as Josh Allen is and as good as their coaching staff is, it's always going to be number 2 in the AFC as long as it's Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. So your roster around that quarterback better be really, really good. And just playing it safe with having a good but not great offensive line and a good but not great receiving core, to your point, AJ, it hasn't worked. So you know what? Let's go big. This is kind of different. I liked it when the Bills had big contracts for Stephon Diggs and Von Miller. They went big with the last 2 years there. This might be going big in this current realm, especially when the Bills don't have a lot of salary cap room to go big roster wide. So I like it better by a little, because obviously your points about the offensive line make a lot of sense. But I don't mind the idea of let's go big at receiver and see really if 17, with all the piano keys around him, can tune up a symphony.
Yeah, and to Carl's point, Joe Brady is going to be a big part of this factor, whether or not he can be the guy to put this all together. He's called plays before, so it's less risky, quote unquote, when Ken Dorsey took over, but certainly it's not a, if he was a great offensive coordinator with a great track record, he wouldn't be the offensive coordinator for the Bills. He'd be a head coach somewhere. So, your options are limited.
I will say about on the Joe Brady front, because that's a good point. The Carolina experiment was kind of weird. Matt Rule was like a power freak over there, allegedly out there in Carolina. So him and Joe Brady really didn't get along and things of that nature. But one thing that was for certain about that year for the Panthers, everyone was eating on offense. Christian McCaffrey went off that year. Robbie Anderson, chosen whatever last name he had at that point, was a really good receiver at that point. DJ Moore had a great year. And clearly the only year where Curtis Samuel had over 1,000 purpose yards was that year as well. They had 4 guys go over 1,000 yards. So he's had experience with having a bunch of ingredients and making things work, but it remains to be seen in this iteration of his career where he's a bit older and with a guy like Josh Allen and maybe pieces that are a little bit more redundant. So he's had experience doing it, but 2024 is a whole different story for sure.
To be fair, the year that Samuel was good, McCaffrey played only 3 games. So that was, now I don't know if it's a determining point here, but it was something that popped up to me to think, well, like you said before, with the Niners, those are overlapping skill sets. McCaffrey and Debo and Curtis Samuel are overlapping skill sets. One of the reasons I would think that Samuel played well is because the guy who overlapped on a skill set was not around for all but 3 of the games that season. Still doesn't mean that, Brady doesn't know how to use him. And this does feel like an offensive coordinator pounding the table for a guy he likes kind of move, which, hey, trust your coaching staff. That's cool. But this is not a guy with a long, to AJ's point, if he had a long track record of success, he wouldn't be here in this job. So I don't know if we want to count on him to be managing the personnel. Not that the Bills scouts, don't have eyeballs also to see what Samuel can bring. All right. Anything else from you guys about this one? All right.
No, just wide receiver day 1 or 2 better still be a priority. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah. All right, agreed. All right. As always, you can watch us talk about any Bills move during the offseason at RochesterFirst.com or on YouTube. For AJ and Carl, I'm Thad. Thanks for watching and listening. We will see you next time. Buffalo does something worth talking about.